nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam vajami gurumishwaram Namashrishtam manumapi shachiputramatra swarupam rupam tasyagrajamurupurim maturim goshtavatim Radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham praptoyasya pratita kripaya shri gurum tam natosmi Shri Govinda Pararavinda Madhupananya Bilasho Jitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashwat Krishna Katha Payorashi Mudo Kedato Vande Bhagavatam Imananudabam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kudari Devatamor Madana Mohan Jar Sivak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Adadana Strinam Yantar Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambhojo Dhyuli Sang Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, by whom his heart's desire was fulfilled in the world, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again, today we'll engage in discussion of Padyavali, Shri Rupa Pad's compilation of verses composed by numerous rasikas, filled with charming verses about Mukunda. So in our last discussion, we went through the introductory verse where Rupa Goswami explains the purpose of the composition, the audience of the composition, the subject matter of the composition, and so forth. So we discussed those four connections, or the Anubandha Chatushtai of this composition, as well as something about the commentary on this text, the Rasika Rangara Tika by Sri Virchandra Goswami Prabhupada, an 8th or 9th generation descendant of Sriman Nityananda Prabhu. Today I went here in Navadip to look at one book which had a piece of Virchandra Goswami's writing where in a set of Sanskrit verses that he composed, he lists himself as a 9th generation descendant of Nityananda Prabhu. So this biographer had him listed as 8th, but in these verses that he himself composed in Sanskrit, he lists himself as 9th, and there's an additional name in the list. So for anyone who's checking, I take the Sanskrit verse to be of higher authority, because you can't really miss out a name, otherwise the whole verse would miss out the syllables and it would be obvious that it was missing. Whereas if you just have a prose list, someone could have easily forgotten to put one name and it wouldn't have been noticed by others later. Anyhow, we heard about Virchandra Goswami and a little bit about this commentary. So now we'll begin the Mangala Charanam, the invocation of auspiciousness. So this is 4 verses where Rupa Goswami, in the 2nd verse that we'll discuss now, gives his namaskar, or his obeisance, to the Iṣṭa-devatā, and then in the following 3 verses he does an ashirvad, or a blessing upon the readers. So one formula is used for composition of invocations, or broadly speaking introductions, where 3 elements are mentioned. This is also the formula that Srila Krishna's Kaviraj Goswami-pad uses in the Chaitanya Charitamrita of Namaskar, Ashirvad, and Vastu Nirdesh, meaning the explanation of the subject matter, then obeisance to the Iṣṭa-devatā, and blessing upon the readers. So we can take the verse from yesterday or from the previous class as the containing a Vastu Nirdesh, or an explanation of the subject matter. So now we'll hear the remaining elements, the invocation of auspiciousness, within that, the obeisance to the Iṣṭa-devatā, in the verse we'll discuss now. So, this is a citation from an anonymous source. Namo nalina-netrāya veṇu-vādya-vinodine rādhādhara-sudhā-pāna-śāline vana-māline. Obeisance unto he of lotus eyes, unto he who produces delight with the play of his flute. Unto he who is adept in drinking the nectar of Radha's lips, unto he who wears a forest garland. I'll read the translation one more time. Obeisance unto he of lotus eyes, obeisance unto he who produces delight with the play of his flute. Unto he who is adept in drinking the nectar of Radha's lips, unto he who wears a forest garland. So, the commentator gives some nice discussion of this verse. He begins by saying that the direct object of the verb, so the first word in the verse, namo, here is the verb or the action in the verse, the obeisance, or the word namo. I like to translate it simply like this, as simply obeisance, but it also can be interpreted to be a conjugated verb, which could alternately be translated in English as I offer obeisance to. You could do it either way. I prefer the little more stripped down way, if you will. So he takes vana-māline at the end of the verse, the compound vana-māline, as the object of the obeisance, and then the other three compounds as qualifiers of that. So what emerges from that way of construing it, because essentially you have this phrase, I'm offering obeisance, and then you have three compounds, which are all in the same case, that any one of them or all of them could be considered the object of the obeisance. So do we have three different objects, or do we have one object that's being qualified by the other terms? Like this is up to how it's interpreted. So we'll follow the commentator's interpretation. So the fundamental point then is that he is he who wears a forest garland, or put out of the dative case, you have the name of Krishna, vana-māline. So van means forest, and mali means a wearer of a garland. So he who's wearing a forest garland. So the commentator suggests that, in offering this obeisance, then one can meditate that there is Krishna in the midst of a beautiful forest in Vrindavan, wearing a bright garland. And then he applies the other compounds as qualifiers of this Krishna there in the forest, sporting in the forest with his garland. So how is he described? He's described as nalina-netrāya. So nalina is a word for lotus. So he who has lotus eyes. So he takes that to mean specifically that his eyes resemble the petals of a lotus. So Krishna is there in the forest with a smile on his face and wide lotus petal eyes. And to say then that he is he who produces delight with the play of his flute is to say that this Krishna, wearing the garland in the forest with these charming eyes, also has the flute to his lips and is playing the flute. So he gives two interpretations to this, saying that one is to say that he produces delight, then because there's no limiting object that receives that delight. In other words, is he producing delight just for one person, or a few persons, or whom? Because it's not specified, then we can say, for the world, for everyone, for whatever is in his midst. So this is one way it can be read, that he's there playing his flute, and it's creating joy for the world, along the lines of Jayadeva Goswami's Vishvesham Manuranjanena, that verse in the Gita Govinda. So, or secondly, you can read the compound veṇu-vādya-vinodine or vinodine to mean that he who is, the first one is he is producing delight with the play of his flute, or we can say that he's accomplishing his play by means of playing the flute. So this is to say that, or what's the implied sense, is that he's playing the flute and calling the gopis into the forest, and therefore accomplishing his desired object, namely playing with Radharani and her Sakhis in the forest, by means of calling them with the flute. So just to say that we offer obeisance to he who's producing delight, or he who's accomplishing his play or his delight by means of the flute, implies this. And that interpretation is supported by the presence of the following compound, rādhādhara-sudhā-pāna-śāline, that he's adept in drinking the nectar of Radha's lips. So in Kavya Shastra, this idea of drinking lip nectar is an ornamental way to refer to kissing. So the commentator adds that this shal in shalin or shaline can also, the dhatu can also be interpreted in the sense of shlag. So shal can mean how one appears or how one shines, and often is taken to mean one who shines in the sense of stands out or excels. So that's how you get this sense of he's adept, or he's an expert at this activity. That's one way it's interpreted. Or the second one, if we take it as shlag, meaning in the sense of the term shlag means to praise, then he takes it to mean that he praises himself, or he considers himself to be successful or praiseworthy as a result of having done this. So, in other words, this is, how he feels accomplished, or he feels satisfied by engaging in this activity. This is a second way of reading it. But in both cases, the commentator takes this to mean, or to refer to, a sense of Krishna's one-pointedness upon Radharani as the supreme object of his love, the way that a chakora bird is one-pointed upon the moon. So we hear throughout Sanskrit literature about certain birds which are known to be profoundly fixed upon one object. So the chatak bird is fixed upon the rain clouds and lives upon rainwater, as we hear about in a verse in the Padyavali, in the Stavamala. And the chakora bird lives on the rays of the moon. And then there's the chakravaka that lives only for its spouse. These chakravaka birds were said to have been cursed by a sage because they were making too much. They were singing too joyfully and disturbing his meditation. So he cursed them to have to spend every night on the opposite side of the bank from one another. So it is said by, observers of bird behaviors that these mates of this species, the male and the female, will stand on opposite sides of a river and then call to each other in the course of the night. So this is said to be the effect of the curse of the sage. But in any way, the way that that chakravaka bird calls to its mate across the river is also used a lot in Sanskrit literature, etc. Along these lines, there are different birds that are said to represent things that are akin to longings of the heart. So here the chakora bird sense is applied. So why does he use the chakora bird? Because in the verse he's talking about drinking nectar. So the chakora lives on moonlight, and moonlight is said to contain nectar within its rays. The Gita describes the moon as rasatmaka, or what is constituted of rasa, or that through the rays of which some rasa comes down and nourishes vegetation. And there are those persons who have done some scientific study about what they call moon calendar gardening, and they find that during certain phases of the moon, plants do better at different times, and this is said to illustrate the nourishing effect that the moon's rays have upon plants. So in that way, we understand that the moon rays can be understood to be sending down some sort of nectarine, nourishing vitality. So the chakora bird is said to live on those rays. So here, the implied sense is that Krishna is like a chakora bird, and he lives on that nectar that comes from the face of Radharani. Her face is moon-like. I have to say, unfortunately, in English, there's some medical term called moon face, which is when the face gets a little bit bloated as like an unhealthy state. So I don't know if how many people are familiar with that, but if we just say what is simply told in Sanskrit, moon face, it evokes the sense of the moon being beautiful, the face being bright, beautiful, like a blossoming appearance. But some might unfortunately acquire the connotation that the face is diseased with this, bloated state. So no such implication implied, just in case anyone was worried, which I doubt they were, but I'm mainly making this as a joke. Anyhow, so Radharani's face is like the moon, and Krishna feels as though he lives upon and lives only for that nectar that emanates from the moon of her face. So Prabodhananda Saraswati and others, as they read this line in the famous song of Jayadev Goswami, Shrita Kamala Kucha Kunjala Mandala He, this long celebrated song from early on in the Gita Govinda. Near the end of the song, there's this phrase, Srimukha Chandra Chakora, describing Bhagavan as he who is a chakora bird of the moon that is the face of Shri. So Prabodhananda and others, they interpret the Shri there to mean Shri Radha. So this is the implied sense of the compound. And then the commentator goes on to say that if we put these descriptions together, what are we arriving at? Which Krishna is being described here? Because from an analytical perspective, there are many Krishnas. There's the Krishna of Vrindavan, there's the Krishna of Dwaraka, there's the Krishna in the company of his cowherd friends, the Krishna in the company of his parents, there's Krishna in the company of the gopis, there's Krishna in boyhood, there's Krishna in childhood, etc. So he says that specifically the Krishna referred to here is the Dhira Lalita Nayaka. So throughout Rasa Sastra, classically there have been 4 types of Nayakas defined, and Rupa Goswami gives his own unique definitions to these 4 classical terms. So I've given here the definition that he gives from the Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu of the term Dhira Lalita. So each of the Nayakas is always called Dhira, meaning he's resolute or he's staunch, he's a powerful person who's able to perseveringly pursue his aims. So he's Dhira in all cases. But what kind of Dhira? You can be Dhira in the sense of tranquil, you can be Dhira in the sense of just and righteous, you can be Dhira in the sense of arrogant or very bold and aggressive. These are Dhira Shanta, Dhira Dhata, Dhira Datta, these other 3. I'm just paraphrasing them. But then this one, the main one, is Dhira Lalita, who's resolute about his play or about his, graceful and charming activities. So Rupa Goswami defines this here as one who's expert, or you could say clever or cultured, freshly youthful, skilled in humor, worry-free, and generally subjugated by lovers, is known as Dhira Lalita, or resolute and playful. Which is to say that Rupa Goswami, as we know throughout the Bhakti-Rasamrita Sindhu and the Laghu Bhagavatamrita and his other works, he sees Krishna as the source upon which all other manifestations of Bhagavan are based, or the whole of which all other are dependent parts. And he sees specifically this adolescent Krishna in the mode of being a Dhira Lalita Nayaka as the most excellent of all forms of Krishna. So here, as he begins the Padyavali, he chooses this verse because this verse vividly depicts that Krishna, or that Dhira Lalita Krishna. So in that way we understand that the Iṣṭa-devatā of Rupa Goswami, as he's making this obeisance, is specifically that adolescent cowherd Krishna who's absorbed in his lila with the gopis. So this same verse of the definition of a Dhira Lalita Nayaka is cited in the Ramananda Samvad, and there's a couple of nice payars surrounding it, so I just threw those in here. I'll just read the translation. It says, Krishna is a Dhira Lalita Nayaka whose acts are an endless play of kama. And here the kama, kama read prema, so specifically Madhura Rasa Prema. So playing night and day in the kunjas with Radha, he fulfilled his adolescence by means of the merriment of this play. So the Ramananda Samvad, for those who are familiar with it, goes step by step, beginning with Varnashram Dharma to Shuddha Bhakti to varieties of rasa in gist, and then later to specific inquiry about the nature of Krishna, the nature of Radharani, the nature of their lila, and the penultimate subject is this: the Dhira Lalita Nayaka's play in the kunjas with Radharani and her Sakhis. This is what Ramananda proposes finally. And then when Mahaprabhu says, okay, now tell me more, again, then he says, oh, no, I can't say any more. But Mahaprabhu insists and he says, okay, now I can only say something if I refer to my own poetry and this more rare esoteric concept of prema vilas vivarta, and then there is where the conversation tops out, so to speak. But what I'm focusing on here is the fact that this topic is the penultimate topic, or effectively what is the primary subject matter that their conversation ultimately reaches, and what is then again spoken of as the sadhya when Mahaprabhu asks for description of how to do the sadhana. Anyhow, without going so much into that, I just want to draw these links that what is discussed by Rupa Goswami in the Sindhu, what is highlighted here in the climax of the Ramananda Samvad, and here what Rupa Goswami is using to open up this compilation of the Padyavali, guess what? They're all pinpoint right on the exact same subject matter. And similarly, when he begins his Stavamala, the first composition he writes after the 3 ashtakams in praise of Mahaprabhu, is a very short, very sweet stotra called the Ananda Stotra, which has 20 names of Krishna, which, spoiler, describes precisely this exact Dhira Lalita Krishna. So everywhere, in a very precise and specified way, Rupa Goswami is showing that this is the object of his meditation, his fixity, and so forth. So the commentator, he adds a couple of additional reasons why this is chosen by Rupa Goswami to be the object of obeisance here in the invocation of auspiciousness. So he says, I've just more or less summarized these, that ontologically there's grounds for this because he's the angshi, or he's the base from which all other manifestations of Bhagavan come. He's the whole of which the entirety of existence is a part. Moreover, that Krishna, who is this angshi, he, of all the rasas that he relishes, Madhura rasa is foremost, and of all the manners in which he relishes Madhura rasa, this mode of doing so as a Dhira Lalita Nayaka is foremost. So this is how the commentator takes it, and my 2 cents is that we know also from so many other places in Rupa Goswami's writing that we could add another step and say that as a Dhira Lalita Nayaka, of all the lila that he performs, the lila that he performs with Radharani is the acme of all such lila. So that is what is referred to by this phrase, rādhādhara-sudhā-pāna-śāline. So in this way, Rupa Goswami gives his obeisance to his Iṣṭa-devatā. So now he comes to the second part of the Mangalacharan, which is the blessings upon the bhaktas, or those who take it upon themselves to peruse this compilation. Then this is how they're blessed. So he says, Ata bhaktanam prati ashirvadaha. Now a blessing for bhaktas. So he gives 3 blessings. This is the first. Bhakti-prahva-vilokana-praṇayinī, nīlotpala-spardhinī, dhyānālambanatāṁ, samadhi-niratair, nīte, hita-prāptaye, lāvaṇyaika-mahānidhī, rasikatāṁ, rādhā-dṛśos tanvatī, yuṣmākaṁ kurutāṁ bhavārti-śamanaṁ, netre tanur hareḥ. Filled with uninhibited love while gazing upon those bowing down with bhakti, or filled with uninhibited love while being gazed upon by those bowing down with bhakti, rivaling the splendor of blue lotuses, accepted by those absorbed in samadhi as the basis of their meditation to attain well-being, or ultimately to attain their desired object. A singular vast reservoir of loveliness, expanding the perfervidness of Radha's eyes. May the eyes and figure of Hari quell the material existence and heartache of you all. So I'll make a couple comments upon the grammatical side of this verse. As we go through, I won't, sometimes the commentator goes into some pretty detailed analysis of the grammar in the verses, and I'm not here to get into all that much technicality of grammar, so I'm only going to discuss those aspects of the commentary when they specifically pertain and enrich our understanding and experience of the implied meaning of the verse. The technicalities which are useful as a translator but don't actually ultimately work out any conceptual difference once the points are translated, that level of detail I'm not going to go into. But this particular verse has a trick or a special ornament of composition inside it, where there's one verb and 2 agents that are simultaneously performing that action. And the rest of the verse is written in such a way where the declensions applied to all the compounds are precisely chosen so that they can apply to either agent. And thus you get a double meaning that pervades the entirety of the verse. So the verb here is kurutāṁ. And kurutāṁ is both a dual case verb and a single case verb. So then he has 2 agents, Krishna's eyes as well as Krishna's body. So they can both be the agent performing this action because the exact same verb conjugation applies to both of these two different numbers within the verb declension paradigm. Conjugation paradigm. So like that, there's a cleverness to it. And the only other specificity to it is, if you see here in the second line, I left this little caret inside the compound, because if you read the verse conjugated according to netre and dual case, then you have to read that as nīte space hita-prāptaye. But if you read it as singular, and the verb taken as singular and the agent being the tanur, then you have to read it as singular, and then you have to read it not as spaced out, but as a closed up compound. And the closed up compound nīte hita is actually a sandhi of nīta and ihita. And the nīta matches with the singular, following throughout and applying to tanur. So this is the cleverness of the poet here. Anyhow, that's why also you have these two different, whether you take it to refer to the eyes or you take it to refer to the figure, most of the compounds translate the same, but a couple of them translate differently, because the first compound in particular, we have the word vilokana, which means gazing or looking. So if the eyes are the agent that's being described, then they're definitely the ones who are going to be doing the gazing. But if the body is the agent, then you can't say that the body is looking, because that would sound a little bit odd. So rather, the sense is that the body is being looked upon, because when you have these type of forms within the compound, you can take the compound then to apply to either an active or a passive sense of the action in the compound, without going into so many technicalities. So in the sense of the eyes, that they're filled with pranaya. So pranaya is a word for love or affection, in particular the type of affection that's expressed without inhibition in the context of intimacy. So his eyes have this uninhibited affection with which they gaze upon the bhaktas who are bowing down. Or his figure is gazed upon with this uninhibited affection by bhaktas who are bowing down to him out of bhakti. In either case, the eyes resemble the splendor of blue lotuses, as does his figure as a whole, and both his eyes as well as his figure are an object of meditation for jnani bhaktas who may be absorbed in samadhi, seeking to attain moksha of some variety. And they're a vast singular reservoir of loveliness. So the word loveliness, the commentator takes in two different ways here, because lavanya, or loveliness, has a technical sense defined in the Ujjal Nilamani as being like the shimmering or the waviness of light that is seen in pearls. So for everyone who's seen pearls, there's a kind of a soft shimmering or waviness of luster that's seen in them. So the sort of soft play of light and glow and shine of the figure, this is called lavanya, which in other times in the past we've described how Saundarya, or beauty, is technically defined as an ideal proportionality of different bodily features. In other words, the depth, the curve, the texture, all of these things are aptly in proportion to one another. This is beauty. And then loveliness is then the play of light upon that mastery of symmetry, if you will. So, in the sense, if we read the verse in the sense of the figure, then it's lovely in that technical sense. But if we refer to the eyes, then we can take the loveliness more broadly to simply mean a brightness or a twinkle in the eyes. And that they're described as a singular reservoir of this loveliness means that their loveliness is better than anything else and not found anywhere else. So it's unique and superlative. So these eyes are then further described as expanding the perfervidness or the rasikatāṁ of Radharani's eyes. So that can mean that the twinkle in Krishna's eyes produces a twinkle in her eyes, or intensifies the passion that's already within her eyes, or that that Krishna's figure then evokes a greater degree of loving attachment on her part by virtue of her admiration of its beauty, etc. Both these can be taken in either sense. So, lastly, the commentator raises a little bit of a technical point, but he brings out a sweet answer, so it's worth discussing. As he says, you could, from a reductive point of view, you could say, well, the eyes are just a part of the body, so why do you have to write this fancy dual use of this verb to refer to the eyes independent of the function of the body when they're just a part of the body? So he answers that by saying that in the Bhagavatam, there's a description of the process of meditating upon the figure of Bhagavan. And Then there are verses that describe specifically meditation on his different facets, his feet, his face, his chest, his eyes, his arms, etc. And each is said to have some special quality or some special influence. So then he cites here a verse that describes specifically meditation upon his glance or upon his sight. So I'll read my translation here. It says, "One should meditate for a long time, with deep feeling in the heart, on his glance, continuously burgeoning with an affectionate smile, deeply serene, and cast from his eyes out of copious compassion, for the sake of quelling the three very fearsome miseries of samsara." So, to meditate on his eyes or his glance is depicted in this way in the Bhagavatam. Alright, then I'll do one more. So, we've now had this is the first of the Mangalacharan, but we can say that what kind of blessing is this? The blessing was, if we go back to the verse, that may these eyes of Hari, may this figure of Hari, may it quell this material existence that you're in. In other words, may it terminate your transmigration here in samsara, and may it relieve your heartache. So heartache could mean, your suffering of material life. It could mean heartache out of repentance for having made offense, or it could mean heartache out of separation from Hari. You could take it at different levels. But in any case, the prayer, or the blessing, is a blessing to remove something undesirable, remove this heartache, or remove this situation of embodied transmigration. So, alright, but how about something positive? How about not just the negation of the negative? How about a blessing for the attainment of something positive? So then, in the remaining two blessings, Rupa Goswami does that. Or in other words, this is how we can see some development or some specificity of why he's adding these additional blessings. So we'll come to the second one. It says, Jai Govardhana Mula Kardama Rasa Vyadashta Barhangara Ye Vrindar Vanaku Kuk Shishu Vrajavadu nīlotpala-spardhinī Chabhanga Sugandaya Kuvalaya Pirasya Dannambhasa Tevo Mangalam Adi Shantu Shatatam Kangsa Dvisho Bhava. So this is another Shardula Vikritita. Sorry for my poor pronunciation. It says, may the arms of Kangsa Dvisha, the peacock tail feather bracelets upon which are smeared with liquid from the mud at the base of Govardhan Hill, which in the interiors of Vrindavan are the blue pillows of the ladies of Braja, and which became finely fragrant with the unguent of Kuvalaya Pida's rut fluid, always bring auspiciousness for you. So this is quite charming, right? You've got to really be someone exalted in order for you to be able to be praised as being caked with mud. In other words, you've got to really be beautiful if you look even more so wonderful that even mud being stuck on you adds to your charm. This is, one initial point. So, anyway, let's go into it. The critical edition here differs from the commentator's reading, so I've made a note of that. But one says that the bracelets are having peacock feathers in them. The other says the bracelets are made of gold. Both, either one, whatever you prefer, on a given day. So why was there mud on his arms? Well, if we can infer this from the Govardhan Lila, Indra sent all these Samvardhaka clouds to wreak havoc upon Braja, so there was all this heavy rain. So the hill was getting, bombarded with rain. So when Krishna picked it up, of course, to get his hand under there, he had to, come around through the earth. So some mud got on his hand. How could it not be? This is, part of the task of unearthing and lifting Govardhan. So as he picked up the hill, then the bracelets on his wrist and perhaps on his skin, a bit of mud got caked on there. So here he looked so charming holding this hill that even the mud looked great. Or the fact that he had this mud on him just made him even more adorable as he stood there effortlessly holding the mountain. This is the sense. So then, in the following line, there's a little bit of a cryptic phrase, kukshishu or kuksha, literally just means an interior. So the commentator clarifies by interior, that means interior in the sense of in the kunjas, deep in the forest, in Vrindavan. Otherwise, I think that's clear. And then, I'm not going to go into too much Puranic lore as we go through this, but a little sometimes. So for anyone who's not familiar, this elephant named Kuvalayapida was stationed at the gate to the arena where Kamsa had arranged this wrestling tournament and had invited Krishna to participate / be attacked and killed according to his plan. So this Kuvalayapida was stationed there as this most ferocious chief royal elephant, and it was thought that when this poor young lad from the pastures came into the city, he would be no match for this massive elephant, according to the deluded thinking of Kamsa. So who was this Kuvalayapida? We hear in the Garga Samhita and perhaps elsewhere some background about this, saying that Bali Maharaj had a son named Mandagati, and once there was a wrestling tournament organized, and this Mandagati, or which literally means like slow moving or heavy moving, was so eager to see the fight that he went crashing through the crowd to get to the front to see the fight. So he went knocking and making, bumping into other people. So there was a sage there named Trita, and he thought that this was very uncultured behavior on the part of the prince. So he cursed him and said that, you're going to be born as an elephant because of your acting like a mad elephant, running through this cloud and knocking over everything. This is very rude of you. So he gave him this curse. So when he received the curse, then he became remorseful. He begged for pardon from this sage. So the sage said, okay, my words will stand, but you'll take birth as an elephant there where Krishna is performing his lila, and you'll get moksha. So this is how it unfolded, and so it's said that he was born in the Vindhya hills and then was captured by Jarasandha, a great king of that era, and then when Jarasandha married his daughter to Kamsa, then this giant mountain elephant was one of the big wedding gifts that was given as part of the dowry to Kamsa by Jarasandha. So in this way, this Kuvalayapida came from the Vindhya mountains into Mathura and became the chief royal elephant of Mathura, and then was goaded to attack Krishna as he entered the arena. But Krishna killed the elephant as well as those persons who goaded him. And elephants are said to exude this juice or this type of fluid from their temples, which comes out during rut and shows that they're in a very passionate state. But that particular fluid is said to be very fragrant or comparable to a perfume. So the idea is that although Krishna had to go to the trouble of killing this elephant, still in the course of wrestling and playing with him and defeating him, he took on the fragrance coming from this elephant's rut juice on his temples, And so he ended up all the more glorious and smelling great as well, as he then proceeded on his way into the arena. So this is what the poet, adds by saying that his arms became finely fragrant with the unguent of Kuvalayapira's rut fluid. Okay, so this is anyway the background of what's being described. So now what's also significant, and what we can pay attention to in many cases here throughout the Padyavali, is that many of these poems describe Krishna in the loose sense, but they don't just describe Krishna. They describe Krishna's eyes, or Krishna's arms, or Krishna's left arm, or his left foot while he's doing this. There seems to be a whole style of composition that we'll see repeatedly throughout. So one of the features of that type of composition is to evoke a more vivid mental impression of that particular facet of Krishna's beauty. Because you could just say the same thing about Krishna. He defeated the elephant, he picked up Govardhan Hill. But if rather we say his arms that have this rut fluid on them, that have this mud on them, then it brings to the mind this, more vivid image of the beauty of his arms. So this is part of the power of kavya, is to its suggestiveness, or the type of warm, like heart-imbibing contemplation that it inspires. So these arms that became caked with mud as he held the mountain, these arms that became perfumed after he fought with this elephant, or these arms that acted like the pillows of the gopis and the kunjas. May these arms bring you auspiciousness. So if these arms have the power to do all of these wonderful things, then how capable are they to bring auspiciousness for you? They're highly capable. And another little subtlety here is that the arms are spoken of in the plural declension. So for anyone who's not familiar, unlike English where we have singular and plural, in Sanskrit you have three declensions. You have singular, dual, and plural. So when you're speaking of two things, you have to use a different declension on the word. So you would expect a verse describing Krishna's arms to be declined in the dual case because he has two arms. But here in the verse, very clearly, it's declined in the plural, which implies three or more. But Krishna doesn't have three arms. So you might say, well, it could refer to him when he has four arms, because we know he has four sometimes. But does it? Did he have four arms in the kunjas with the gopis? No. Did he have four arms when he picked up Govardhan Hill? No. So why is the poet using the plural case to describe a dual object? This is a point that the commentator raises. So he refers to then another convention in Sanskrit, which is that the plural, apart from referring to items of three or more, is also a way of describing an object with respect. So when it's used to describe or speak with respect, you're not literally meant to think that it refers to three or more, but you're expected, as a cultured reader, bless you, to infer from the context with your, guess what, intelligence, that the implication of the statement is not literal plurality, but rather an offering of respect. And you yourself, all by your big grown-up self, can understand this from the context using inference. These tools in hermeneutics are so essential to understanding all of the literature that the Goswamis wrote, as well as that they commented on, and here in the Padyavali, the Bhagavatam, etc. These are, like the ABCs of interpretation. So you can see, for example, all throughout the Sandarbhas, that Jiva Goswami, many cases when he's quoting from Sridhar Swami, he'll refer to Sridhar Swami Padanam, or the Sridhar Swami of 3 feet. If you were to put it literally, like, huh? So obviously he's speaking of the feet of Sridhar Swami in the plural case as a way of speaking about him with respect. And just in a few verses down, we'll see that when a verse of Vishnu Puri is quoted, then the verse that follows that quotation is also by him. So in the attribution that's given, it says Tesham Eva. It's theirs. So he refers to Vishnu, it doesn't say his, meaning the previous authors, but he says theirs, or he uses the plural to convey respect. So anyway, this is a common convention. Many may already be familiar, but in case you're not, now you are. So the commentator, he makes this point. And then he raises one other thing, which is that how is Krishna described in this verse? He's described as Kamsa Dvisha, or Kamsa Dvish. So the word Dvish means an enemy or a foe. So one might say, why is he being described as Kamsa's foe or Kamsa's enemy here, when all of the Leelas described took place before he ever met Kamsa and before he killed Kamsa? You know, picking up Govardhan Hill, sporting with the gopis, even killing this elephant. This all happened before he fought with Kamsa. So it would seem a little bit odd, and if many of these verses are intended to be taken from, you could say, the Vrindavan angle of view, or that they're being perceived as descriptions of this Dhira Lalita Nayaka Krishna of Vrindavan, the adolescent, the Iṣṭa-devatā of Rupa Goswami, then this name Kamsa Dvisha doesn't seem quite fit. So to alleviate this concern that some may acquire, then he says that, or wait, does he say that here? Oh, maybe he makes this point, a point related to this. I was thinking of a point that comes in a few verses later. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I'll say more about that in a minute. But the point that he makes in this comment is that, sorry, I'll just spoil the beans on what I was going to say before. What it comes up in a later comment is that Krishna also, although it's not literally mentioned in the Bhagavatam, Jiva Goswami does mention that it's implied in the Bhagavatam by a very careful analysis in the Krishna Sandarbha, and is literally stated in the Padma Puran that Krishna does come back to Vrindavan after killing Dantavakra. So the people of Vrindavan could well be in the midst of their Leela with Krishna in Vrindavan and still speak of Krishna as the killer of Kamsa or the performer of deeds that he did after he left Vrindavan. That is possible because he came back to Vrindavan, and the description or the discussion could be conceived within that context of him in Vrindavan after having returned. And as Jiva Goswami takes it, it's after returning and sporting for 2 months that Prakash goes back into the uppercut. So that can also be conceived of as an eternal sphere of Leela, if you will. Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit again, but that's half of what comes up later. And the other point is that in his Leela in Vrindavan, Krishna, although he doesn't directly deal with Kamsa or kill Kamsa, he's attacked by so many of these asuras that Kamsa is sending again and again and again. So to be described as the enemy of Kamsa is to allude to Krishna having had to fend off and defeat all of these very powerful asuras. So it alludes to the totality of the prowess and the formidable use of these arms that he had. So that use of that name then, when this verse is saying, may those arms of Krishna bring auspicious to you, then those arms that were powerful enough to defeat Aghasura and to defeat this asura and that asura and all of these, and lift Govardhan Hill, those arms, when they have all such power, then what doubt can there be, or how assuredly and joyful shall we remain when we think of those arms working in our favor, when we think of those arms in action to bring about auspiciousness for us. like this, we can draw out some sense from the name Kamsadvisha that supports the spirit of the blessing. Okay, so I think I'll stop there for now, and in the next discussion we'll get to the third and final blessing of the Mangalacharan, which, having a blessing from Krishna's eyes and Krishna's figure and Krishna's arms, then we get a blessing not even just from Krishna's bodily parts, but just from the sounds of his flute. And why is that so important that it gets included even here in the prestigious position of having a place in the Mangalacharan? Then the commentator has a nice way of explaining that, which we'll hear next time. So I'll pause here. If anyone has any comment or question, feel free to share.
Jayadeva Babaji, did you submit to us everything, like all the blessings as well? Because I think last sentence in the PDF you provided is stated that having thus cited the blessing related to the removal of unrest in the next verse.
Oh, I see. Okay, the second blessing verse, I forgot to put that in the file. Pardon me for that.
Actually, both are not in the file.
Oh,
so
really?
the first blessing is there, meaning that removal, but the two auspiciousness not mentioned.
Okay, all right. I'll send that on.
And I have a question.
Okay.
Not question, it's a little comment, because it says that at one point it glorifies Krishna's beauty such that even mud or some dirt on his face makes him more beautiful.
Yeah.
And as a parent, I have direct experience that children, they look so beautiful when they have something on the face, like some smudge.
Bravo.
And then, listen, and that's the interesting part, because actually Krishna is given as example of when he's lifting Govardhan hill. But in the prayer here, specifically, nalina-netrāya is being referred to as being glorified, which is teenager, right?
Yeah.
So then I find like, oh, is he still looking like a child, although being older and so beautiful that even smudge on his face looks beautiful? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the adolescent age, I mean, maybe the lifting of Govardhan Hill was a little earlier than that, but a little stretching, I think, is welcome.
Yeah. Because I don't feel, well, and of course you can question beauty of Krishna, but as the more the face matures, then, you need ornaments on the body and around the face to augment the beauty. But if you consider kids like 4 years old, 5 years old, then obviously that's not the case. Mm-hmm. But if Krishna is like Dhira Lalita, what's the age? A Dhira Lalita would be 16, 17?
Usually they take it as 15, 14 to 15, 16 max.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's beautiful anyway.
All right, great. So today we've heard the obeisance to the Iṣṭa-devatā. Oh, we have another question? Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Baba, for this beautiful class with so many beautiful analogies that it would take another hour to list all of them. I especially like the one about Chakara growth, who is drinking moonlight nectar, so beautiful. I have a question. Sometimes, it says that Krishna is playing with the gopis in the forest of Vrindavana, and sometimes it says that he's sporting in the forest. So, specifically, when you are referring to him sporting in the forest, what kind of games are they playing? Are they playing like sports, like analogous to our world, like they are playing some sport games, or like what is meant by sporting? What's the difference between playing and sporting?
So sporting, even in English, I'm hearing an echo. Let me try that. Okay. In English even, sporting has a literary sense, apart from the newspaper section of sport with scores from football matches and all of that. So sporting can refer more to like free-spirited behavior, or we have other English words like frolicking. So in this context, in reference to the gopis, they're not playing football or, like smashing rocks or something like this, the way he might play with cowherd boys, swinging off of trees or running and chasing each other and that kind of wrestling. Not like that, but in the context of the gopis, this might mean, dancing or strolling through the forest, making jokes, telling riddles, and playing maybe some hide and seek. All of these sort of togetherness, swinging on swings, splashing in the water, all these type of activities as you hear about in Govinda-lilamrita and elsewhere in Rupa Goswami's works. So it's in a looser sense.
Understood. I have one more question about something you have described in the last class. Specifically, you mentioned that one of the criterion for adhikari, or the hearer or the listener of these lovely Padyavali verses is to have one-pointed awareness or focus on Bhagavan's lotus feet. So this is one of the criteria for the one who is able to perceive, like in the right way, these Padyavali verses. So my question is, could you please kindly share some tips how to develop this one-pointed awareness or focus on Bhagavan lotus feet in order to be able, like, perceive the Padyavali verses, like, in the way Srila Rupa Goswami advises us to perceive?
Well, one thing that I've heard and I find to be nourishing and supportive of one-pointedness, of the mind becoming more and more one-pointed on Bhagavan, is this really nice collection of poems by Rupa Goswami called the Padyavali. In other words, to hear about Krishna, to nourish one's desire for Krishna, this is itself what will make the mind one-pointed upon him. Because there's akantita, or one-pointedness, in the yogic sense of trying to resolutely, with willpower, by doing what's called abhyas, just repetitive refocusing of the mind each time it strays from its point of focus. And that's important, that's part of mantra meditation, that's a practice, that's good. But the path of bhakti is not purely dry abhyas as such. Rather, the idea is that the mind won't need to be continually hit and refocused when the samskara that produces a sense of absorption and relish in the object named Bhagavan, the greater in degree that samskara becomes predominant within the psyche, the stronger the mind's tendency will become to gravitate and remain fixed upon Bhagavan just by the way itself is programmed, as opposed to having to repeatedly refocus it or force it because its conditioning is constantly leading to it having a tendency to go elsewhere. So, of course, this is a very gradual, in most cases, a very gradual process, and we use, you could say, a dual strategy where we, on a daily basis, do forms of abhyas, where we're sort of mechanically or practically fixing the mind and repeatedly bringing it back. And through this literature, through these discussions, we're nourishing that sensibility, that sense of appreciation, that sense of Him being our own, of us belonging to Him, of a connectedness at heart, wherein the mind will more and more have that as its object naturally, as an accord. Because where does the mind go? It goes to those things that produce happiness for it. And the things that produce happiness for it are the things that it recognizes as being accessible and suited to it. So the more we get that sense of identification with Bhagavan, the more we perceive Bhagavan as the sole ultimate object of our every desire, apart from which all other desires are undesirable. Or in other words, when the desire for Bhagavan becomes the desire governing one's thoughts and the criterion upon which acceptance and rejection and the deliberation upon favorable and unfavorable is done, this will be the principal orientation. As we hear about in the Sindhu, the primary characteristic of bhava bhakti, which is again the object of sadhana bhakti, is tadeka sprihatvam, desirousness of Him alone. To desire Him alone, this is the very spirit of bhava bhakti. Without this, in the words of Prahlad Maharaj, vidambanam. When bhakti is done with another desire, it's a sham, it's a pantomime, it's an imitation. When it's done out of the desire really for Bhagavan and desire for Bhagavan. In other words, we don't want Bhagavan so that He gives us moksha. We want Bhagavan so that we can please Him. So to desire Bhagavan for Bhagavan, what is called tad anukul yatmika, tad anugata, tad spriha, tad anubhav heta gugulasamoy gyanavishesh lakshita, priti. That priti is defined as it's constituted of favorability to Bhagavan and of desire for Bhagavan that is an expression of favorability or an expression of the pursuit of pleasing Bhagavan. So in this way, to desire Him, the more that desiring Him becomes prominent in our daily flow of thoughts, the more the mind will, of its own accord, remain gravitated in that direction. So this is the broader ultimate purpose of all of these discussions, all of this literature, all of these reflections, prayers, etc., is such that desirousness shall flourish. And insofar as the desire is there, that much the mind will go in that direction, because the mind is just goes after its desired objects. That's its function, if you will. So many things could be said on that topic. That's a few words in this context. All right, so let's conclude for the evening, and if we're so blessed, we'll again soon absorb ourselves in more of these lovely poems compiled by Rupa Goswami Pad. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.